So, the question about acceptance rates for opening other forms of peer review, Maria Kowalczuk.
Hello, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this meeting. My name is Maria Kowalczuk. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Research Integrity and Peer Review, which is published by Biomed Central, and I'm also Research Integrity Manager at Springer Nature. And I have done this research in collaboration with Michelle Samarasinghe, who is a senior data analyst at Nature, which is also now part of Springer Nature. And we analyzed Biomed Central and Springer Open journals, which are now also part of Springer Nature. So that's our declaration of any competing interests. And the sort of rationale stems from the anecdotal evidence from our editors that it is not easy to recruit reviewers, and I think many people in the room will sort of have experienced this as well. And I, as an editor, realized that recruiting reviewers is one of the most time-consuming parts of the manuscript life cycle, and also our journal performs open peer review. So again, that's we have heard from other editors of open peer review journals that it's a difficult task to recruit reviewers. So we were wondering whether there is any way we can look into this. There is a recent study looking into perhaps whether reviewer fatigue is a problem which is contributing to these difficulties, and it was found that actually this isn't a major factor. So the fact that there is an increasing number of journals, an increasing number of submissions that seem to be outpacing the growth of the sort of base of experts who are qualified to review. And so that could be one of the factors, but there are probably, apart from busyness, many other factors that contribute to any individual decision to undertake peer review that the experts are making. So our question was whether the peer review model of the journal is one of such contributing factors. Because quite interestingly, most of the surveys of researchers and reviewers show quite consistently that the double-blind peer review model is pointed out as the most unbiased, as the most fair model. But on the other hand, as we've heard in this session, authors often claim to be able to recognize who reviewed their paper. Reviewers also often are able to identify the authors in the double-blind model, so none of the models is perfect. So we set out to determine whether there is a difference in proportion of reviewers who agree to undertake peer review of manuscripts for journals that use different peer review models within the different subject areas that are covered by our portfolio. So we performed a retrospective analysis of Biomed Central and Springer Open journals, and that was done for the period of time when these journals were handled on one common platform, so all the manuscripts were handled within this one platform. So we were able to generate a report which would provide us with a number of reviewers who accepted an invitation to review or re-review a manuscript. And the limitation of this study is that we were not able to distinguish between whether these invitations were to do the primary review or to re-review a revised manuscript. And from these numbers, we calculated the proportion of all invited reviewers who accepted an invitation. And we grouped the journals into the three models that are used by our portfolio of journals. So the open model, so out of the existing 122 definitions, the one that we use is that the authors know who the reviewers are, the reviewers know who the authors are, and also the reviewer reports, signed reviewer reports, are published alongside the published article. So that's our open model. And the majority of our journals use the traditional single-blind model, where the authors don't know who the reviewers are, but not vice versa. And also we have some journals that use the double-blind model, where both the authors and reviewers are blinded to each other's identity. And we also looked into the 10 main subject areas that are covered by our portfolio as listed here to see if there are any differences by subject area. And the results are published as Table 15 in the Book of Abstracts. And what I wanted to focus on at this moment is that we analyzed almost 500 journals. And although the majority of them use the single-blind peer review model, we also have quite a few journals that use the open model and the double-blind model. So although there are differences in sizes between these groups, for each of the analyzed group, we were able to analyze thousands of manuscripts and thousands of reviewer invitations. So overall, we were able to look at almost 300,000 manuscripts and almost 1.5 million reviewer invitations. And we have found that in total, about 50% of the invitations were accepted, but there were differences between groups of journals using different peer review models. So about 60% of reviewers accepted the invitations for the journals that operate the double-blind peer review, and 42% journals that use open peer review. So that also translated into the average number of invitations that were sent out per manuscript. So as you can see within this graph, when you look at the accepted invitations, it was on average 2.5 accepted invitation per manuscript for each of the groups, so for every peer review model. But that meant that but the numbers of invitations that were sent out were quite different. So for the journals that use the double-blind peer review model, on average a little bit over 4 invitations were sent per manuscript, and it was closer to 6 for the journals on open model. So there is a clear difference between the numbers of invitations that were sent out. But as you can see, these differences are not that staggering. This wouldn't be a difference that would, cause major issue or break a journal. And we have identified 4 different subject areas within which we have journals that use all the 3 different peer review models. And here, again, for each of the subject area, we found that the highest proportion of reviewers accepted an invitation to review for those journals that use the double-blind model, and the lowest proportion accepted an invitation for a journal that does open peer review. And we also looked into whether the differences are statistically significant, and we found that they were between the models, and also the differences were statistically significant for the open model. So statistically significantly more reviewers accepted an invitation to review to perform open peer review for the clinical medicine journals than, for example, for biomedicine, health sciences, or life sciences. So it seems that perhaps within clinical medicine, open peer review is perhaps a more established model, and reviewers seem to be more comfortable with that. And this is just to show you the matrix of p-values for pairwise comparisons of those proportions of reviewers agreeing. So just to show you that the majority of these comparisons were statistically significant, or the differences were statistically significant, but not all of them. And apart from those 4 subject areas that I mentioned before, for the other 6 subject areas, we only have journals that operate single-blind peer review. So this is what we looked in at the next stage. We compared proportion of reviewers who accepted an invitation to review a manuscript on the single-blind model for the our main 10 different subject areas that we cover. And as you can see, the differences here are not very large. For some reason, the highest proportion agreed for the journals within the mathematics field. We are not sure why this is the case. We haven't looked into the detail. But for all the other subject areas, it was between 52% and 60% of reviewers accepting an invitation to review on the single blind model. So again, we did pairwise comparisons of these proportions, and some of the differences are statistically significant, but not all of them. So just to summarize, for our data set, we found that on average 5 invitations to review were sent per manuscript and 2.5 were accepted, but there were differences between groups of journals operating on different peer review models, so the highest proportion of reviewers agreed to review for the journals that used the double-blind model and the lowest for open peer review. And that meant that on average a little bit under 6 invitations were sent per manuscript on the journals that use the open model, and a little bit over 4 invitations on the journals that use the double-blind model. And the general proportions were similar for different subject areas, and there were statistically significant differences for the open peer review model, where for the clinical medicine journals, a higher proportion of reviewers agreed to do open peer review than for the other fields. And looking into the single blind model, when we looked at the 10 different subject areas, the highest proportion of reviewers agreed for the journals in the field of mathematics. So just to summarize, going back to the original question, peer review model of the journal is probably to some extent a contributing factor to the decision to peer review, but it's not the only one, probably not the decisive one. So perhaps open peer review comes with some challenges, but not insurmountable challenges. And as we've heard in all the discussions this week, no peer review model is perfect, and the decision to on which model to adopt, should be a lot of different considerations should be taken into account, and interest of reviewers could be one of them. Thank you.
Maria, thank you. Questions? Someone heading for the microphone. Oh, leaving the room. Yeah.
Chris Papaz in Kansas City. I actually look at that difference of having to contact one additional reviewer for an open access, for open peer review as quite significant. If you go through the way my journal works, we contacted a reviewer. If we don't hear anything back, we contact them again, we contact them again. So having to contact one additional reviewer can result in a delay of potentially a week on the initial review, and then on a resubmission, another week. So, this could potentially cost you 2 weeks as far as the overall acceptance duration for that particular manuscript.
So what we have found kind of practically working on these journals, it's that it's a good idea to invite a large number of reviewers to start with. So perhaps if you invite 6 reviewers in the first round of invitations, then you have a fairly good chance of having 2 or 3 agreed. So it sort of pays to put in a little bit more effort initially, and then it should be okay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Tahir Pillay, Journal of Clinical Pathology. At this conference, I heard a lot of comments about the merits of open peer review, but what I'm seeing now is that from your study, if you add the double blind and the single blind, it seems that blind reviews is the preferred system for most reviewers. And I think the other question I want to ask is has there been any data comparing the rate of acceptance between blind reviews and open reviews? Because I suspect that it's human nature that if you have an open review, you're more likely to review the paper favorably. So has there been any comparison between the rates of acceptance between a blind review process and an open review process?
So we did a study previously where we compared 2 different journals, one of which was using single-blind peer review, and the other journal was using double-blind. And so the problem with our journals is that we have only 1 peer review model per journal. So there is no way of checking this within one journal. But when we compared 2 journals which were in many ways similar but differed by the model, we found that at the end of the day, the rate of acceptance, there was no difference in the rate of acceptance. But of course, these were two different journals within slightly, so there are probably some confounding factors. So I think some further research would need to be done to establish this.
Just to use my chair's prerogative, there have been randomized trials, and I'm aware of 2 of them, having been involved in them, which looked exactly at that, blinded versus open review at the BMJ, and we found that there was a small increase in acceptance rates amongst the open group, but not significantly so. And we felt that because we have an internal editorial team, that didn't impact on the overall acceptance rate. And we found that the reviews themselves were, if anything, slightly more acceptable, in terms of their quality. So it is possible to do randomized trials in this area, and I would encourage anyone who's looking at open peer review to do a randomized trial before they actually introduce it and see that within their own specialty area.
Thank you. I'm Bertti Salahen from the Finnish Medical Journal and the European Journal on Neurology. And I have a comment, because those acceptance rates I think they are extremely high, because in the European Journal of Neurology the acceptance rate is 29% for invited to review. And another point, in the Finnish Medical Journal we just moved to double-blind peer review, and we are going to explore what happens also on the quality of the reviews. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, a limitation of our study is that we were not able to distinguish between reviewers who accepted the primary review invitation and an invitation to re-review. So perhaps some of the acceptance rate was inflated by the same reviewer being invited again to review the same manuscript after revisions.
Thanks.
Hi. This is Bahar from Elsevier. Maria, I have a question for you. Did you consider looking into, to begin with, was it possible for you to check whether changing the peer review model from one journal, from one model to the other would impact any of the factors that you looked at? And I have also a comment. We have a very small pilot in Elsevier with 5 journals. We switched from single blind to double blind, to open, in the sense that reviewers' comments to authors were published alongside the accepted article. And we looked at the reviewer acceptance and completion rates. The pilot is up and running for 3 years, and we compared the reviewers' acceptance and completion rates before the pilot was live. And now that it is up and running, we couldn't find a significant difference. I could see that, for example, seasonality is making a bigger difference than switching between the models. Thank you.
Yes, so within our portfolio, we had only one journal that changed the peer review model in the time frame that we analyzed. But looking at the data for just a single journal, as you said, it did not give a conclusive answer because the data is quite noisy for one journal. So that's why we thought if we look at large portfolios, we can see a difference. But within one journal, there was no significant difference.
Thanks. Yep.
Hello, Chris. Work at Wiley, volunteer at COPE. A question. What do you think about combining double-blinded peer review with open peer review? Sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? But I could imagine blinding the peer review part of it and then opening it up at the end once it's all happened. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I think it's a very interesting thought, and it's definitely worth trying out. So I know that one of our journals, Nature Communications, is offering the authors a choice of single-blind, double-blind, or transparent peer review where the reports are published. So I'm waiting for them to sort of complete the pilot and see what the outcome would be. And I think it's very worthwhile to try out and pilot different approaches, such as the one you mentioned. So I would encourage editors who would be interested in this sort of research to undertake it, because I think it's definitely worthwhile trialing different options and combinations.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Maria.
Thank you.